You watch the Sochi cauldron rise under floodlights. Athletes smile for cameras while, inside the lab, a hole in the wall lets clean urine replace tainted samples. How deep does the swap go? You enter the Sochi anti-doping lab at night. FSB officers hand over pre-mixed Duchess cocktails to athletes. The McLaren report will later name this exact method. What happens when the wall hole opens? You follow the chain from coaches to ministry officials. Every positive test vanishes before it reaches WADA. Rodchenkov, the lab director, records every order in sworn testimony. Can the system stay hidden forever? You see the Olympic rings projected on snow. Behind them, Russia's government insists no state program exists. The McLaren evidence points the other way. Which story will the world believe? You stand with the athletes as medals are awarded. Hours earlier their samples traveled through the wall. CAS will later clear 28 for insufficient proof against each person. Who carries the real proof? You read the first McLaren pages. They map FSB tampering at Sochi down to individual bottles. Rodchenkov's testimony supplies the names and dates. Does the paper trail end at the Kremlin? You watch IOC hearings begin. Russia denies everything. Yet the lab director's sworn account describes exactly how the hole worked. What single piece of evidence could still be missing? You trace one sample bottle from the wall to the freezer. Its number matches an athlete later cleared by CAS. The method is proven, individual guilt is not. Where does justice stop? You listen to Rodchenkov describe the entire operation on record. He is still alive. The Russian state calls him a liar. The McLaren findings remain. Which version will survive the next ruling? You follow the trail to the Sochi lab's hidden panel. A drilled hole lets clean urine bottles pass from the FSB to technicians overnight. Rodchenkov swears the order came from Moscow. Who signed the first directive? The state denies every link. The Duchess cocktail appears next, a 3-drug mix dissolved in whiskey. You watch the timeline of athletes receiving it before events. How many doses crossed that threshold before WADA noticed the first anomalies? You open the McLaren files and see the IP addresses traced to Russian ministries. Data disappear and reappear with new timestamps. Where did the original server logs go? Rodchenkov names 3 FSB officers who controlled the swaps. You check their service records against the Olympic security roster. 2 names match. The third has vanished from every public list. A single athlete sample survives retesting years later. The steroid profile still matches the cocktail. Yet CAS later clears the same athlete. What exact evidence threshold finally separates system from individual? You map the money. Lab upgrades, FSB overtime, and courier flights all appear in state budgets under unrelated codes. Which ministry first approved the hidden line item? The first crack surfaces when a Russian whistleblower hands WADA a single photo of the hole. You hold the image. How many other photos were destroyed before that one survived? Rodchenkov records the entire chain on sworn video. The Russian state labels him a traitor and demands his extradition. Which recording will the next tribunal accept as unaltered? You reach the final McLaren annex. It lists 1,000 samples swapped. The IOC suspends Russia, then CAS restores 28 athletes. Where does the chain of proof end and reasonable doubt begin? You stand inside the Sochi lab as FSB agents drill a secret hole through the wall. Urine samples pass through it at night. Rodchenkov watches the Duchess cocktail mixed on camera. How many athletes knew the liquid they drank contained 3 banned steroids? Swapping begins the moment an athlete finishes their race. You follow the chain, bottle number logged, cap unscrewed, contents replaced with clean urine. The McLaren Annex records 1,000 such exchanges. Which single bottle still carries an unbroken seal? Rodchenkov testifies the operation ran under direct state orders. You see the Ministry of Sport emails approving the protocol. Russia denies any central plan existed. The next tribunal must decide whether one man's memory equals institutional proof. The IOC bans the entire Russian team from future games. CAS then clears 28 athletes for lack of individual evidence. You hold both rulings in your hands. Where exactly does collective guilt stop and personal innocence begin? You trace the clean urine back to a secret Moscow storage facility. Athletes supplied it months earlier under FSB supervision. Rodchenkov swears every step on video. What happens when the state that stored the samples now claims they never existed? Another medal is stripped. Then another restored on appeal. The numbers keep shifting. You reach the final list of implicated names. How many more files remain sealed in the same annex that listed the first 1,000 swaps? Rodchenkov remains in hiding, still giving sworn statements. The Kremlin calls every recording a forgery. You watch the same footage accepted by WADA yet rejected by Russian courts. Which version of the tape survives the next hearing? The Duchess cocktail recipe appears in lab notebooks dated 2011. You read the exact ratios. Russia insists these were private experiments. The next investigator must prove whether private notes equal state policy. You close the McLaren report. 1,000 samples swapped, yet 28 athletes reinstated. The chain of evidence ends here, or continues somewhere else. Which page will the next commission decide to reopen? You reopen the file. Rodchenkov's sworn testimony names FSB officers who drilled the hole in the Sochi lab wall and passed clean urine through it at night. The names match internal Russian ministry records. Yet Moscow calls every page fiction. Who wrote the orders that reached the lab? The IOC strips Russia of its Sochi ranking and bars the flag from future games. You watch the empty podiums on muted screens. Then CAS restores 28 athletes for lack of individual proof. The medals stay revoked or returned depending on which ruling you read last. Which list is final? Rodchenkov remains in hiding under new identity. You hear his latest public statement: the system began years before Sochi and continued after. Russian officials repeat that no state program existed. The two accounts run on parallel tracks that never meet. Where does the next sample go? WADA demands ongoing access to Russian databases. You scroll through the latest compliance report. Access is granted, then restricted again. Each delay adds months. The athletes whose samples are still frozen wait without knowing their status. How many more winters pass? The Duchess cocktail formula sits in the archived notebooks. You compare the 2011 entries with the 2014 test logs. The ratios match exactly. Russia maintains these were individual experiments. The signatures above the entries belong to state lab directors. Who approved the budget line? You reach the final annex. 1,000 samples moved through the wall. Only a handful produced individual sanctions that survived appeal. The rest sit in legal limbo. The next commission will decide whether the pattern itself constitutes proof. What page stays sealed? The Olympic ban lifts after 2 cycles. You watch Russian athletes march again under a neutral flag. Cameras cut to officials smiling on the sideline. Rodchenkov's recorded voice continues on another channel. The two images occupy the same broadcast feed yet never touch. Which version do viewers retain? No new McLaren-style investigation has been commissioned. You close the current file. The chain of custody ends at the last published ruling. Somewhere the samples and the notebooks remain. The next investigator will choose whether to open the same drawer. Which page will they decide to reopen?